This video is brought to you by Brilliant. If you only listen to their rhetoric, you might assume that Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party really don't like immigration. They're perhaps the most vocal opponents of the EU's new migrant relocation scheme. They worry that Muslims immigrating into Poland threaten Christianity, and they literally built a fence on the border with Belarus to prevent migrants coming into the EU. However, contrary to the rhetoric, Poland actually reliably issues the most residency visas in the EU. And earlier this week, the government announced plans to simplify immigration laws from 18 mostly Muslim-majority countries in order to take in 400,000 immigrants annually. So in this video, we're going to have a look at Poland's remarkably generous immigration policy, why it's sort of required by Poland's demographics, and how it compares to the government's rhetoric. So let's start with a bit of context. Poland's population was relatively stable in the first decade or so after the fall of communism in 1989, but the number of people emigrating from Poland started increasing significantly in the late 1990s to about 100,000 per year, and then skyrocketed after Poland joined the EU in 2004. Empowered by freedom of movement, millions of Poles left their home country to work in the rest of Europe, in search of higher wages and better living standards. Over the next few years, over 2 million Poles moved abroad, mostly to Western Europe and the UK, where the Polish population increased more than tenfold. By 2011, it was estimated that 5% of all Polish citizens had lived outside the country. Young Poles were especially keen on emigration. A 2014 survey found that an astonishing 90% of Poles under 34 had considered emigrating. During the first few years of its EU membership, Poland didn't really experience any significant immigration, which is why its net migration figures were almost always negative. As a consequence, Poland was one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries in Europe, and the smallest immigrant population that did live in Poland was mostly Ukrainian and Belarusian, with an even smaller Vietnamese diaspora. Interestingly, Poland's Vietnamese diaspora has its roots in the 1950s, when the two communist countries started doing student exchange programs, and today there's an estimated 50,000 Vietnamese living in Poland, making them the biggest non-European migrant group in the country. This started changing in the late 2000s and early 2010s, when the numbers of people immigrating into Poland started to increase. Now, the data here is a bit shaky, because Poland has at least 2 immigration databases, and they give different numbers. But according to municipal data, the number of people immigrating to Poland really started increasing in 2008, and by 2009, net immigration into the country was nearly stable. As we see it, there are 2 reasons for this change. First, the centre-right government led by Donald Tusk's Civic Platform Party that ruled Poland from 2007 until 2015 realised that it needed immigration to balance out Poland's demographic pyramid. Poland's high emigration rate could have been offset by a high birth rate, but Poland, like many other former communist countries, has a really low fertility rate, i.e. the average number of children per woman. Poland's fertility rate has basically oscillated between 1.2 and 1.4 since 1999, which means that, even if Poles weren't emigrating, Poland's population would have been getting older and smaller anyway. For context, the replacement rate, i.e. the number required for a stable population, is 2.1, and the EU average is about 1.5. Anyway, this combination of a low fertility rate and high emigration meant Poland's population was getting smaller, which means a smaller economy, and older, which means a higher tax burden, because you need to make young workers pay more tax to fund public services for old retirees. Tusk's government realised this was unsustainable, so they loosened immigration restrictions and even announced 2 amnesties for illegal immigrants living in Poland, once in 2007 and once in 2012. The second reason for this change was Poland's economy. As we've explained in a previous video, Poland's economic growth has truly been astonishing. Since regaining its independence from the USSR in the early 1990s, Poland's GDP per capita has increased tenfold, and the OECD estimates that the median Polish household will actually be wealthier than their UK counterparts before the end of the decade. Poland's economy has also been remarkably shock resistant. It fared well during the pandemic, and proved similarly resilient during the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent Eurozone crisis, and its economy continued to grow steadily throughout the late 2000s and then the 2010s. This made Poland an attractive location for economic migrants and discouraged emigration by native Poles. This provoked a bit of backlash from some of the Polish electorate, and the right-wing Law and Justice Party won the 2015 election, promising to restrict Poland's migration system and reject the EU's compulsory migrant relocation scheme at the height of Europe's migrant crisis. Since coming to power, Law and Justice have continued to talk a tough game on immigration. Earlier this month, for example, the Polish Prime Minister said that Poland does not acknowledge the EU's new migrant relocation scheme, which would require member states to pay €22,000 for every migrant they refuse from their EU-allocated quota. However, Law and Justice have continued to allow lots of immigrants into Poland. Even before the massive influx of Ukrainians earlier this year, Poland reliably issued the most residence permits in the entire EU. Those mostly went to Ukrainians and Belarusians, but a significant fraction went to Indians, Turks, and Central Asians. Law and Justice actually went one further last week when they announced plans to simplify immigration procedures for 18 countries, including most of the Middle East, in order to accept at least 400,000 immigrants a year. This is because, despite the increase in immigration, Poland's population is still shrinking, and the country is experiencing growing labour shortages. While Law and Justice would say that their policy is consistent with their rhetoric and that they just don't like what they see as illegal immigration rather than immigration generally, it does feel a bit incongruous. For starters, seeking asylum isn't generally illegal, and the EU's migrant relocation scheme is actually legally mandated by EU law. Second, Law and Justice spend a lot of time warning about the perils of immigration from Muslim-majority countries. One minister actually claimed the EU was, quote, imposing Islam on Poland, and another MP said that Poland wouldn't take in a single Muslim, but they're now asking for 400,000 immigrants from mostly Muslim-majority countries. Ultimately, it'll be interesting to see how this combination of anti-immigrant rhetoric and liberal immigration policies affect Law and Justice's electoral chances at Poland's next election, due later this year. It's interesting that even as people ostensibly into politics, the TLDR team spends more and more time analysing data and economic information as it becomes more and more critical. As a bunch of people who are ordinarily more focused on words than numbers, we've really benefited from courses on brilliant.org in order to keep ourselves sharp. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths and computer science in a fun and interactive way. From foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. Even if you, like us, don't necessarily think of yourself as a traditional STEM kind of person, these courses could prove incredibly useful for your life and career. Courses like data analysis and the fundamentals of statistics can help anyone ensure that they're properly understanding our increasingly data-driven world, which is good news if your boss suddenly asks you to analyse a trade war, an economy, or the collapse of a currency. Just hypothetically. Anyway, you can try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days by clicking on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support and for watching TLDR.